You're listening to the Mind Over Murder podcast.
My name is Bill Thomas. I'm a writer, consulting producer, and now podcaster. I am now trying to use my experience as the brother of a murder victim to help other victims of violent crime. I'm working on a book on the unsolved Colonial Parkway murders, and I'm the co-administrator of the Colonial Parkway Murders Facebook group together with Kristin Dilley.
My name is Kristin Dilley. I'm a writer, a researcher, a teacher, and a victims advocate, as well as the social media manager and co-administrator for the Colonial Parkway Murders Facebook page with my partner in crime, Bill Thomas. Welcome to Mind Over Murder. I'm Kristin Dilley.
And I'm Bill Thomas.
And we're here for an exciting and much overdue episode of Ask Us Anything, Colonial Parkway Murders Edition.
Now, Kristin, I know you expressed some disappointment that the questions didn't involve some of your favorite questions, and we'll get to those later, I think.
Yes. But before we get into that, do fill us in a little bit, Mr. Thomas, about your trip to Austin, Texas for the True Crime Podcast Festival. Inquiring minds want to know how it went. Did you love it? Was it great?
It was great. For the benefit of our listeners, we were both planning on going, and Kristin's schedule got a little bit full with school starting up, and she was not able to attend. So I had to solo this thing, which was not as much fun as when Kristin's there.
Oh, thank you.
And everyone was asking for her. I made it clear that she was fine and she was just busy with school and not able to attend. Because for some reason, they start school in Williamsburg and maybe in the South, I'm thinking, earlier than lots of other places around the country.
We used to have the Labor Day law where you didn't start school before Labor Day, and that was largely because we've got the big amusement parks around here and you wanted teenagers to work those as much as possible. But recently there's been that change over the last couple of years where you can start earlier and hopefully finish earlier. So we started on August the 28th this year.
Seems against the natural law of things.
Feels a little weird, but yes. But that does mean that we have a 4-day weekend because they give us the first Friday off and then Saturday, Sunday, then Labor Day, Monday. About to do a 4-day weekend. I'm okay with that.
Understood. True Crime Podcast Festival was terrific. It's more of a conference of podcasters. There are fans there, but there are a lot of true crime podcasters from around the country, many of whom we know, and then many others I was excited to meet. Terrific group. I was glad that True Crime Podcast Festival is mostly an indoor sport because it was 105 degrees in Austin, Texas.
Ugh.
It was brutally hot. I actually went outside the Doubletree Hotel where the event was held once or twice and got to the front door and said, nah, and went back inside.
Nope. It's too hot, even for Texas.
It was awful. Now, the atmosphere inside was nice and cool. The hotel was very nice. They had it set up so there were 2 big rooms. One was the main room where they presented cases and discussed important issues. A lot of discussion about ethics and true crime. And then there was a secondary room, which was a similar presentation room set up like a small auditorium with a screen at the front and microphones and comfortable chairs. And I presented on the Colonial Parkway murders, along with the absolutely terrific people from the podcast Murder in the Rain. And they presented on one of their cases. And they were absolutely lovely. So we had a 1-hour session and they went first and we went second. And then we saved room for questions at the end. And the audience was very interested. They asked a lot of great questions. Adjoining those 2 rooms was a medium-sized ballroom that was packed with all of the various podcasts having set up. So you could go around and talk to the podcasters. And of course, there was only me, so I could only be in one place at one time. So there was a lot of running around. There were so many terrific presentations. I wanted to hear what many of the other investigating officers and forensics experts, and especially true crime podcasters, had to say. And there were a number of survivors and victims' families there presenting on unsolved cases, which is very interesting, but it's also heartbreaking because you're hearing family members talk about missing and murdered loved ones, and that's always difficult. It's like a smaller scale version of CrimeCon. I really enjoyed it. Next year is going to be in Denver. Sounds beautiful and a terrific location. They're moving it further back into the summer because everybody agreed that August in Texas was pretty toasty.
I know, I imagine so. And it would be definitely better for those of us that have back to school type jobs, or I think for some people, probably just back to school kiddos.
Yes.
To be able to do something a little further from the start of the school year. We'll see about doing Denver next year. I've never been to Denver. I think that would be cool. We'll see. And we are looking forward to CrimeCon here, which is only 21, 22 days away now.
Yeah.
So I'm very excited by. We're going to have an absolute blast. Yeah, it's going to be great. So thank you to everybody who showed up. We know we did have some fans who showed up to talk to Bill, and I wish I could have been there as well. The school job pays the mortgage, so that's the one I have to give precedence to. We do hope to see everybody at CrimeCon here fairly soon in about, like I said, 21, 22 days.
Yeah, looking forward to it.
Let's go ahead and jump into our questions. We went ahead and posited to not only our social media group for Mind Over Murder, but also the Colonial Parkway Murders group. What questions do y'all have on the case? And boy, did people deliver.
They sure did. The questions are fantastic and really thought-provoking. Kristin had come up with this idea. She said, we haven't done this in a while. And I said, you're right. And I thought, well, let's see what kind of response we get. Not only are the questions fantastic, but every single day when we would look at social media, there were more and more interesting questions and nuanced questions. Thanks to everybody. It was so interesting to see what you're curious about, what you're thinking about, people's ideas and theories. So I hope people will enjoy these episodes.
Yeah, it's going to definitely be 2 and maybe possibly even 3 episodes. When I was going through and looking at all of the questions, I compiled them into a large list here. We're going to go in categories here. And the first is going to be just case related. The second set is going to be suspect related questions. The third set is going to be DNA and FG related questions. And then the fourth set is going to be everything else, including just a couple of random things that people threw in. So,
we like random.
Yes, no, random is good. And I actually put in our post, like, when we say ask us anything, that means you can ask us about like our favorite dinosaurs, our favorite zoo animals. Nobody asked about either of those 2 things, by the way. I was a little...
As I discussed with you earlier today, I think you are the co-host and producer of this podcast. You have every right to add any question you want, and so we're going to at least answer the favorite dinosaur question.
Yes, we will.
But not now.
No, not right now, but we will at some point figure out both Kristin and Bill's favorite dinosaurs.
Why not?
Okay, so we're going to go ahead and just kick it off here, and we're starting with in the category of general Colonial Parkway Murders case-related questions. As we do with these episodes, I'm going to go ahead and give first name, last initial as to who asked the question, and then I'll pose it, Bill and I will answer it, and we'll move on from there. And we'll just do as many as we have. We have about a list of about 30, so we'll see how we do. It's going to be multiple episodes. All right, so we're going to start with a question from Charlie C. Charlie C asks, with the parkway being federal property, why was the Virginia State Police and York-Poquoson Sheriff's Office called to the scene when the National Park Service Rangers should have secured the scene and called the FBI to handle the scene and collect the evidence and handle a proper investigation? There are too many agencies involved at this crime scene.
Now, keep in mind, Kristin and I weren't there, and the Colonial Parkway Murders kicks off in October 1986 with the death of my sister, Kathy Thomas, and her girlfriend, Rebecca Dowski, followed by the other murders. So I feel like this person, Charlie, thanks for the question, is kicking us off with a question that might be mostly focused initially, I think, on the Thomas Dowski crime scene. Charlie, you're absolutely right. The parkway is federal property. It's a national park. And as we've discussed before, if you are murdered in a national park, or go missing for that matter, the National Park Service investigative rangers have jurisdiction. And if it's a murder specifically, the FBI is called in from the very beginning. As we understand it from the people that were there that night, there were a number of different agencies that reported to the scene. And this happened in the other incidents in the Colonial Parkway murders as well. National Park Service and FBI would have had jurisdiction. We know for certain that both Virginia State Police and York-Poquoson County Sheriff's officers were on scene. And there were first responders, probably some firefighters and rescue workers as well, because specifically in Kathy and Becky's scene at the Cheetah Mannix Overlook, the car was actually pulled off the embankment along the York River before the bodies could be taken out of the car. We're not experts on this, but we know these other agencies were there mostly in an assist role. And as far as we know, the first people on scene are National Park Service rangers, and the person that is mentioned as breaking the back window of my sister's Honda Civic, which obviously is problematic, especially in retrospect, that person is supposed to be a National Park Service ranger. The ranger who was probably first or maybe second on scene when what was originally called in as a traffic accident, when he reported there, he didn't know he was dealing with a murder scene. He just knows he's got a Honda Civic that's down the embankment, caught up in brush, with its nose fairly close to the water of the York River. And he's trying to figure out, have the people inside the car, have they driven over the edge of the grassy embankment in an accident? He doesn't know that they've been murdered. So he's trying to get down and get a look at the vehicle. The doors won't open because the two-door car is wedged in that underbrush with its nose in that downward position. He can't really see very well through the glass, and so he makes a decision to break the window, probably with his baton or something like that. And so he shatters the back window of the Honda, and then once he shatters the crime scene with broken glass, he's peering in, and he realizes he's got two people, both deceased, my sister Kathy in the way back in the hatch area, and her girlfriend Rebecca Dowski in the back seat on an angle. I think at that point, he steps back and realizes he's got something far worse than a traffic accident on his hands. There's some mixed versions of the story. We don't know exactly when the FBI arrived on scene. We've heard a couple of different versions of the story. And one of the things that's going to be a through line here in some of these answers we give you is we can't always tell, and we've certainly asked FBI and Virginia State Police at different times, but they don't answer questions in a very straightforward manner. They have the attitude that they ask the questions and don't answer questions. I'm not saying they've never answered questions, but very frustrating, and sometimes I feel foolish because people will say to me, what about this? What about that? And I'll have thought to myself, and Kristin, I'm sure you'll want to weigh in here, we've thought, we ought to know the answer to that unless someone who was there on the law enforcement side will answer the question in a straightforward manner. It's still kind of guesswork.
With a lot of these questions, and they're all excellent questions, I was responding to people on our various pages saying, yes, we'll address that. And a lot of times I found myself having to type, law enforcement will not tell us that, but we will speculate. Or law enforcement will not answer that, but we'll do the best we can. There is so very much here that we want to know just as badly as all the rest of you, but until the FBI or the VSP decides to cough up information, we're as in the dark as the rest of you are, and we can only use the information that we do have and some informed speculation along the way to try to provide you with answers.
I'll add something else, too. I agree. I do want to make it clear, our guesses, if you will, are educated guesses. We have interviewed a number of different law enforcement people over the years, particularly for the television series, which we actually shot twice, the Lover's Lane Murders series on Oxygen. So there's dozens, if not hundreds of hours of footage, and I was there for almost all of it, and Kristin was there for a fair amount as well. So we interviewed a number of people that are in that kind of first responder, FBI, VSP, York County, and other agencies. I've spoken to most of these people one-on-one, particularly when they're retired. They're often more willing to be frank about what they remember, because we are talking about cases that stretch back 33 to 37 years now. These are educated guesses. We're basing our responses on what people who were there have told us they remember about those days and nights working the investigation in all four crime scenes.
Let's go ahead and move on to a next question. This is from Shelley R. Shelley asks, I'm curious why the county will not let anyone come with cadaver dogs over the years to see if remains were driven further up the parkway and dumped in the woods. No evidence they were dumped in the water, besides a scent followed to the bridge in the initial investigation. If their remains can be located, they could contain evidence. I do want to actually ask something about the phrasing of Shelley's question, Bill. Is it the National Park Service that is not allowing the cadaver dogs, or is it York County itself? Can you shed some light on that before we go into the actual question?
National Park Service has actually been the responsible agency. For instance, I think Shelley is talking mostly about the Keith Call Cassandra Haley disappearance.
Yes.
That's the one where Keith's Toyota Celica is found on the Colonial Parkway at the York River overlook, which is, 1 to 2 miles away from the site where Kathy's car was found a year and a half prior. So the responding agency has always been the National Park Service. And about 10 years ago, they did allow cadaver dogs, after much back and forthing with the families. The Call and Haley families had arranged for cadaver dogs to be brought in, and they did search some specific areas, overcoming resistance from the National Park Service. The Park Service was completely bizarre. They were almost obsessed with the fact that not one blade of grass could be disturbed by these dogs. They behaved as if the flowers, plants, and trees and grass of the gorgeous area we know as the Colonial Parkway was somehow more important than finding the remains of Keith and Sandy, which a number of us found pretty objectionable. However, when the families amped up the pressure and began to call out the Park Service publicly, the Park Service did back down, and they did allow the search to continue. There have been discussions over the years about having additional searches of the parkway, and the FBI has conducted their own searches. Now, they don't run into the problem with the National Park Service that the families from the Call and Haley family did. I know there have been searches conducted, and I've seen photographs of people and dogs searching the parkway and the water, looking for, particularly, I think, for Keith and Sandy's remains. So we know it's been searched multiple times, and the county has not played a role as far as I know. It's always been the National Park Service allowing and sometimes standing in the way of cadaver dog and other types of searching.
My current concern that I've mentioned both to Bill and to the Call family and the Haley family as well is that right at the moment, the Parkway is undergoing a massive multi-million-dollar rehabilitation project over the next 3 years. And right now there is a ton of construction happening in the area around the York River Overlook and the Cheatham Annex Overlook with lots of heavy construction equipment. I sincerely hope that someone from the FBI or the NPS or some other responsible agency has put the word out to the construction crew that is doing all of this work and said, hey, can you please be on the lookout for 2 sets of human remains? And we are still potentially looking for a murder weapon in Kathy and Becky's case. I sincerely hope a responsible party, and I would hope it would be the FBI, would have come to the construction crew and said, this is something we are still looking for. Please be aware. I don't have a lot of confidence that has happened, but I'm willing to be surprised and pleased by the outcome if so.
I agree, and we just don't know if they've put the word out. It would be great if they did. Now, I'm not there. I know I'll be in Virginia with you, Kristin, and other family members for a memorial service that's planned for Keith Call. That'll be the first time I'll have been on the Parkway in the last year or two, I would say. I don't exactly know, except based on what you've told me, what those construction projects look like. Are they close to the settings of Thomas Dowski and Call Haley?
Yes. They are. They're right up along those areas. Right at the moment, based on what they're doing, they are closer to Kathy and Becky's scenes than they are to where Keith's car was found. As our questioner, Shelley, had asked, I don't think it's outside of the realm of possibility that Keith and Sandra's bodies were moved. And if that's the case, then every construction crew, as they go through the phase of this project, should be on the lookout for potential human remains, because they might not just have stayed in that area where the car was found. It could be anywhere on the Parkway.
That's true. One other reply to Shelley, interestingly, in that incident that I was describing where the Call and Haley families had brought in cadaver dogs, the cadaver dogs actually did hit on something. And the way the cadaver dogs work is they're trained to smell, they're looking for the smell of human remains, and they did hit, and they sit down, they stop and they sit down, and they're indicating to their handlers, this is a spot. After pushing past all that resistance from the National Park Service, we were pleasantly surprised. It was a very hot Sunday afternoon. Temperatures were in the 90s. There were news crews on scene being held back at some distance. The dogs actually did hit on one of the suggested areas, and the FBI on a Sunday afternoon zoomed in there with an evidence recovery team and took over the scene and did a dig. Got the dogs and everybody else out of there. It turned out the remains were much older. And as Kristin can tell you, there's a lot of history there in that part of Virginia. And there are unmarked graveyards and even unmarked graves that don't have anything to do with the last 30, 35 years. So there were remains found, and they did figure out, this is a much, much older gravesite. Now, the dog has no way of knowing that. So the dogs did their job under really difficult circumstances because they do better when the weather's cooler. But I will say that after pushing past the resistance of the Park Service, when the families found something, the FBI just swooped right in and took immediate control. And we were actually very impressed by the level of response from the Bureau Evidence Response Team.
Our next question is from David R., longtime listener and frequent respondent on our page. It's really more of a sort of a supposition than a question. I'll go ahead and read it out, though. David says, I would like to know where the killer or killers first crossed the victims' paths. My general theory is that the killer was a prowler who trolled the area searching for victims. So I would like to know where he spotted these victims and how he approached them. And I think that's definitely a question we all have. Bill, do you want to expound on your theory as related to Kathy and Becky?
Yeah, David's asking a great question here. One of the things that's key, David, is are these people, the victims, involved in a chance encounter with someone who is there at these locations just looking for a couple pulled over who may or may not be involved in sexual or romantic behavior, or may just be two people sitting in a car? Or are they being followed somehow? I think in some of these examples, and I know some other people have asked us this, and we'll get into some more detail as we move forward. I'm not sure that all of the Colonial Parkway murders are even related. As I've said before, the more I learn about these cases, the less I personally think they're all related. I think there's a very good chance that Kathy and Becky, for example, were stalked. That is, someone was following them. At the same time, when you move into incident number 2, Robin Edwards and David Knobling, I think they may have actually planned to meet someone at Ragged Island, perhaps to do a low-level drug deal, buy some pot or something like that. In incident number 3, which is Keith Call and Cassandra Haley coming home from the party at Christopher Newport University Apartments, that one is the biggest mystery to me. Yeah. Because I can't figure out whether Keith and Sandy might have encountered somebody at this college party involving multiple apartments and kids going from place to place, or if someone followed them from the party. The odd thing about Keith and Sandy is, as we've talked about before, they end up on the Parkway, but that's not on the way home to her parents' home in Grafton. It's, right. What do you say, Kristin, 15 to 20 minutes out of the way?
It's definitely further away from where they should have been. I've always wondered, I'm coming around to this idea based on something a friend told me or speculated about, because we spend a lot of time speculating about this. I'm wondering if they didn't get accosted in the parking lot leaving the party and that someone just put a gun to their head and said drive, or if somebody was waiting in the backseat of the car. I don't know, but you're right. It is the biggest mystery out of all of them.
Incident number 4, Phelps Lauer, I'm back to the idea that Anna Maria Phelps and Daniel Lauer may have made plans to meet someone, perhaps to buy some pot or something like that. And again, I'm not passing any judgment here. These are young people doing young people things. It's not like they're the only kids in America that ever bought a bag of pot or smoked a joint in a car while listening to music. Something about that crime scene up there off Interstate 64 feels very different from the other Colonial Parkway murder scenes. I think that in Phelps Lauer, they have may have planned to meet someone that they knew. The money that Daniel was carrying, $600 to $800 from painting jobs that he had done that summer with his father, that money disappeared. Robbery is a potential motive in incident number 4. So Phelps Lauer feels very different to me as well. So back to David's initial question, is he thinking this is somebody who trolled the area looking for victims? It's a reasonable question, David, but I'm not sure that's actually what's happening here.
Yeah, I think it really does have to do with whether you want to fall in line with the idea that so many people have embraced over the years. Is there one serial killer stalking couples on and off the parkway? If so, David's question is great and valid. If not, then you do have to approach it in a piecemeal. How did each group of victims, assuming they're all related, come across their assailant? I think there's really no way that we're going to know until we have an arrest, get a confession, hopefully, or something along those lines. But it's a great supposition, David. And I know that David comments often on our posts, so I know that this is something that he thinks about quite a lot. Thank you for weighing in, David, and your concern and pondering of the case is very welcome. We appreciate it.
You're listening to Mind Over Murder. We'll be right back after this word from our sponsors. We're back here at Mind Over Murder.
We've got a question from Nancy, and honestly, I don't think this is a question either of us have seen before, Bill. Nancy E. asks, were uniformed patrols on night shifts for places like Carter's Grove ever considered? For anyone who doesn't know, Carter's Grove is a plantation here in Williamsburg. We have many old plantations from the very early days of the colony, some of which have been rebuilt and turned into tourist destinations. And Carter's Grove is one of those. I've never actually been to Carter's Grove in all my years here, but it's the question of, are there people, I don't even know if there are uniformed patrols, private or otherwise, out at the plantations. And I don't think we've ever had anyone bring up the idea of anyone from Carter's Grove. Have you heard that ever anywhere, Bill?
No, I'd never heard of Carter's Grove until we were talking about it today in preparation to record this session. I want to maybe step back Nancy's question a little bit. First of all, if Nancy has more information for us, we welcome hearing from her again about why she would think Carter's Grove, which appears to be plantation. It's a historic home. It looks beautiful in the photographs. I think the step back for me is, are there uniformed patrols in any of these locations?
Yeah, number one, absolutely.
And let's go through this. As we understand it, and again, we weren't there and we can only rely on the law enforcement people that have talked to us about this. The Colonial Parkway was exceptionally lightly patrolled at night. And one veteran police officer, who shall remain nameless for the moment, who's been very helpful to us behind the scenes, had said to us, if people knew just how lightly patrolled the Colonial Parkway was at night, they would have never gone there because it was that dangerous, is what he's saying. People like Joyce Call Canada have told us when they were kids, young teenagers, they knew you could go to the Colonial Parkway and drink beer and hang out and make out with your boyfriend or whatever because there were essentially no patrols. Particularly when you get into the third shift, that 11 p.m. to 7 a.m. late shift. At different times over the years, sometimes York County would patrol the parkway with some sort of service arrangement with the Park Service. That 23-mile-long ribbon of land was extremely lightly patrolled. In the two incidents that are on the Colonial Parkway, we can say pretty definitively the road was very lightly patrolled. In incident number 2, Nobbling Edwards at Ragged Island, the cops did swing through there and still do. And interestingly, Ragged Island, the parking area is actually quite close to the James River Bridge. State troopers and other local police do swing through there pretty frequently. So that one's probably reasonably well patrolled, and certainly law enforcement officers saw David's pickup truck in the parking lot. Now, obviously, there were no bodies at that point. And as far as we know, they had already been murdered and their bodies had been dumped in the water. The police officers did see the abandoned vehicle and were checking it out. In incident number 4, Phelps-Lauer, Interstate 64 is pretty well patrolled by the Virginia State Police. But again, the police found the vehicle abandoned at the wrong way rest stop, heading back towards Amelia County instead of in the direction of travel towards Virginia Beach. That hunting ground off Interstate 64, I think, had no patrolling whatsoever.
No, it's private property. Yeah, very interesting question there from Nancy. And again, we would urge anybody who has information, but Nancy in particular, if you have information that might help us understand a little bit more about your question, please do send it to us. We do appreciate that. Next question is from Bart D. And I think this is a great question, and it does involve a little bit of supposition from us, but I think that's fine. Bart asks, I question if Keith's car was dumped at the Parkway after disposing of the bodies elsewhere and utilizing an accomplice to pick up the murderer. This could be a possibility at the New Kent rest area as well, as the victim's car was found at the westbound rest area when the victims were traveling eastbound. Possibly they were abducted at the eastbound rest area, driven to the site where their bodies were found, and the car dropped at the westbound rest area with an accomplice either following behind or an agreement to meet back there. So again, not really a question, more supposition, and I think it's pretty solid.
Yeah, I think so too. Let's break this down a little bit. So Bart first asks about Keith Call's Toyota Celica. Now, this is Keith and Sandy heading home from the party in Newport News at the University Apartments. I do think that the car is abandoned at the York River Overlook. I don't think the murder took place there. It's essentially a disappearance, but I don't think they were made to disappear at that location. And I do agree that the car was likely dumped there. Given the fact that we're talking distances of miles, I would say it's probably pretty likely that if they dumped the Toyota Celica at the York River Overlook, the murder took place elsewhere. Yeah, I think there has to be an accomplice following in another vehicle. Driver takes the Toyota, drops it off, gets out of the car, leaves that location in a vehicle likely driven by someone else. Now, Bart makes a lot of really good points in the Phelps-Lauer incident, number 4. This is out on Interstate 64, about they're traveling eastbound, as I had mentioned a moment ago, and yet the vehicle is found in the westbound mirror image rest stop. They're on both sides of the divided highway there, Interstate 64. I don't think it's necessary, though, that there be a second vehicle. One of the things that was pointed out to me by one of the investigating officers is if you encountered Anna Maria and Daniel in the eastbound rest stop and then, say, asserted control, maybe produced a gun or whatever, and told them to drive one exit further eastbound and then to get off there, then turn and take a left, go over the highway, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah.
Turn onto a dirt road, which leads you to the hunt club area. After killing them, that individual could have then driven the Chevy Nova back westbound about a mile or so and stopped at the rest stop. He or they could have left the vehicle there and run across the grassy and wooded median from one side of the highway to the other. It might not be necessary to have a second vehicle. In that supposition, let's just say, Anna and Daniel make arrangements to meet someone at that eastbound rest stop as they're driving towards Virginia Beach, perhaps to make that pot deal that I talked about. It's also possible this could be a random encounter at that rest stop with a police officer or a wannabe or someone, presenting as a police officer. It would be possible to do all this by leaving the offender's vehicle parked at the rest stop. He gets into the Chevy Nova with the two of them and then forces them to take the journey I just described, then drives the car back, the Chevy, parks the Nova, runs or walks across the median. It's late at night. If he waits until no cars are coming, doesn't see any headlights, he scampers across the first part, hides in the trees, waits in the median until there's no cars coming eastbound, runs across the 2 lanes of traffic there, and then he gets back in his car and drives away. It does make perfect sense, and this was explained to me by an FBI agent several years ago.
It's not like 64 is so heavily traveled that there is never a time when there are no cars on the road. There are definitely times where there would be no headlights, no cars coming, that you could make that trek, like you were describing, Bill, on foot with no worry that you're going to get slammed into by an 18-wheeler.
If you just wait in the dark, and you don't even have to stand that far back. If you're standing behind the tree line in the middle of that median, you just wait, you listen, and then wait till whatever cars or trucks are going by. I recognize Interstate 64 does have traffic 24/7, but there are gaps between clusters of cars and trucks.
Yeah, absolutely. And it is dark out there at all times. It doesn't even matter that there are rest areas with well-lighted parking lots. It is dark no matter what. And it's an interesting bit of supposition, and that's definitely something that makes sense thinking about it. We've already hit on this question from Gary S., but let's go ahead and just put it out there on the record anyway, because it is a great question. Gary S. asks, how convinced are we that these 4 crime scenes are actually related? What evidence actually links them, if any? We do need to talk about the second half of this question for sure, because to the best of our knowledge, and again, this is with the assumption that we have all of the facts, and we don't. Unfortunately, the FBI does not like to share. But to the best of our knowledge, there is no forensic evidence linking all 4 crime scenes.
Correct. And we've asked this question repeatedly, and we is a number of the Colonial Parkway Murders families. Now, we haven't had a group face-to-face meeting with the FBI since January 2010, which is unacceptable from my perspective. But we have had individual meetings with the FBI and the Virginia State Police much more recently. We've asked them the question over and over again, and the answer continues to be, according to the FBI and the Virginia State Police, there is nothing in the forensics that links these 4 crime scenes. Kristin, what you're saying continues to be accurate as far as the information that's been provided to us by law enforcement.
I do agree with Bill that I think it is very likely that as some of these cases get solved, others will come off the table. I do not think at this point that Anna Maria and Daniel's case at New Kent is connected to the others. I think that is going to be the first to go off the table, because it just seems more likely to me, given the fact that there is money missing from Daniel, that what happened to them may have something to do with a robbery gone bad or a low-level drug deal gone bad. I think that is more likely than the theory that I know so many people like, which is that there is a serial killer walking around and stalking couples or driving around and stalking couples. I think if anything is going to fall off the table, so to speak, first, I think it will be Daniel and Anna Maria.
I agree. And at the same time, I still openly question whether even the 3 remaining Colonial Parkway murders are necessarily all related. I could be completely wrong. I certainly have been wrong before. That's just where I am in 2023, based on lots of additional research and, as I said, interviewing many FBI agents, Virginia State Police agents, crime scene reconstruction experts, and not all of the discussion that we had ended up in the television series. I sat through lengthy interviews, and in many cases twice, for hours, discussing the details of these crime scenes. And again, they're not going to remember everything, but they remembered a lot. Their observations are firsthand. I'm way less than convinced that these 4 double homicides are necessarily all related.
Someone a little bit later down our question list does make a point. She asks whether or not Lori Ann Powell might be considered a Parkway case. We consider Lori Ann Powell and Brian Pettinger, I call them the Parkway adjacent cases. I don't think it's out of the realm of possibility that either of them might be connected to a leading suspect that may be connected to one of the 4 primary Parkway cases. Maybe it's entirely possible that we're going to have to rename and rethink what we consider the Colonial Parkway murders cases, even accounting for these 4 and maybe taking one off the table, Anna Maria and Daniel. Do we even have all the cases? Should we be considering Lori and Brian as part of it? I don't know. It is definitely something that comes to mind when I start considering the name as a whole.
Things that keep us up at night.
Yeah, no, seriously, it is.
And we're not alone in that regard. And by the way, anytime we're talking about any of the Parkway adjacent cases, we're not minimizing the importance of those cases. We're just saying these 4 double homicides have been grouped together and referred to as the Colonial Parkway murders by the media, not by the investigators.
Yeah, exactly.
The name itself is a media creation that came out of local Virginia newspaper, television, and radio coverage back in the 1980s. And they began referring to them as the Colonial Parkway murders. I've even said, Kristin, there have been times when I've thought that even the name, the Colonial Parkway murders, it's a little bit misleading because only 2 of our incidents even happened on the Parkway. And even then, maybe only partially on the Parkway, as we were talking about with Keith and Sandy. I'm not sure whatever happened to them even transpired on the Colonial Parkway.
Yeah.
In a way, the name itself is a rabbit hole because we've all assumed that all of these cases, particularly for folks around the country and around the world that are learning about these cases, they think they all happened inside the national park when the reality is they didn't.
And the interesting thing, too, that sort of comes out of that is the fact that it's going to be 37 years in October for your sister's case, the oldest of them. The case has become branded, if you will, in this way. There's no way that we could change that moniker now. We've become so used to referring to the case in this way that if we started referring to the case by any other name or I'm sorry, it's sad to say, but it's true. If we started just addressing the cases by the names of the victims, most people aren't going to know who we're talking about. They know Colonial Parkway murders. As a whole, they know what that looks like. But a lot of times, and I include myself in this before I started working with you, by the way, I didn't know the names of the victims for a long time. I knew 4 double homicides, but as an amorphous whole, that's what I knew them as. And so it's weirdly this question of if the case has to be branded in any way. And as true crime becomes much more like a media construct and a publicity machine, you almost have to brand it in a particular way. If it has to be branded as anything, it's just the Colonial Parkway murders. I can't think of anything else we would call it. Certainly we wouldn't call it the Lover's Lane murders. That was a goofy decision from Oxygen. And I don't care if they know it, they didn't pay me. So they didn't pay me to work on the show. They paid you. You can't say anything about it, but I can. Lover's Lane Murders was a stupid name. But how else would we refer to it? Even though it is a little misleading, I can't think of any other way we would refer to it.
For the record, I didn't care for the name either.
We have 21 more questions in this grand lineup that we need to answer. And we haven't even gotten to suspects yet, and certainly not to DNA, which I think most everyone wants information on. So we are going to have to continue this for 1 and possibly 2 more episodes. If in the meantime you do think of more burning questions, send them our way. We are happy to respond to them either online or right here on the podcast, and we will do our best. We are entering what I unfortunately have to think of as anniversary season here, because Anna Maria and Daniel's anniversary is Labor Day weekend, and then come Robin and David's, and then Kathy and Becky's. We're going to spend a lot more time over the next couple of weeks answering questions, putting up information about the case on our Facebook and Instagram. And do we even have a Twitter page anymore? Oh, I'm sorry. Do we have an X page anymore?
Yes, we do.
We have an X page. Okay. So we'll put stuff up on Facebook and Insta and X. I just can't call it that. That's ridiculous. As we continue to move forward. So please feel free to reach out to us at any of our social media pages. That is going to do it for this episode of Mind Over Murder. Thank you so much for listening. We'll see you next time.
Mind Over Murder is a production of Absolute Zero and Another Dog Productions.
Our executive producers are Bill Thomas and Kristin Dilley.
Our logo art is by Pamela Arnois.
Our theme music is by Kevin MacLeod.
Mind Over Murder is distributed in partnership with Crawlspace Media.
You can follow us on Facebook, Twitter, or Instagram.
You can also follow our page on the Colonial Parkway Murders on Facebook.
And finally, you can follow Bill Thomas on Twitter at BillThomas56.
Thank you for listening to Mind Over Murder.